The story begins in a world both familiar and strange. 100,000 years ago, the African plains stretch wide beneath vast skies, a mosaic of grasses, woodlands, and rivers winding toward the horizon. The people moving across this landscape are fully human, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, yet their lives are bound to rhythms far older than any written memory. Daylight offers warmth and food, but nightfall brings a chill that settles heavily across the land. Even in Africa, where these communities thrive, temperatures can fall low enough to bite. As glacial cycles intensify far to the north, cooler, drier climates reach deep into their home territories. The wind at dusk whistles through branches carrying a crispness that urges bodies to huddle together, fires to be tended carefully, and shelters to be built sturdier. Naked skin, once sufficient in more stable climates, now grows vulnerable. The air stings and survival begins to demand more than fire alone. This is the threshold where clothing enters the human story. Evidence for this moment is fragmentary, for fabric and hide rarely endure across millennia. What remains are indirect signs, the stone flakes discarded beside hearths, the bone awls polished smooth by repeated use, the faint marks of cutting left on animal bones, showing not only the hunger for meat but the gathering of skins. Each trace hints at gestures repeated countless times, scraping, stretching, softening hides into something more supple. Such work takes place in firelight under shelters of branch and grass. A hunter's kill provides not only food, but also a covering against cold night air. Hides become more than waste. They become second skins taken from animals and reshaped by human hands. In these earliest moments, clothing is not yet tailored, not sewn into the forms recognizable today. It is likely a simple draping hides worn across shoulders, tied at the waist, perhaps fastened with thorns or strips of sinew. Yet even these first coverings mark a quiet transformation. They extend the human body, allowing it to resist the environment in a new way. Fire warms only as long as it burns. Hides can travel with the body, shifting the boundary between human life and the outside world. Archaeologists place the emergence of clothing not in a single invention, but in a gradual response to climate. Around this period, the Pleistocene epoch is shaped by cycles of glaciation. Ice sheets expand across Europe and Asia, locking water in frozen masses, altering global winds and rainfall. Africa becomes cooler, drier, more unpredictable. The grasslands extend, forests retreat, and rivers shrink. Survival demands resilience, and resilience takes many forms. Migration is one technology another. Clothing belongs to both categories, for it allows groups to stay where temperatures drop, and it makes journeys possible into lands otherwise too harsh. In time, this development will support the great dispersals of Homo sapiens out of Africa. But here at the beginning, it is simply a matter of enduring cold nights, of wrapping a hide around a shivering child, of keeping elders alive through changing seasons. In the archaeological record, the absence of direct garments is balanced by indirect but powerful clues. Genetic research has traced the history of lice, tiny parasites that have travelled with humans across epochs. One species, body lice, lives in clothing rather than on bare skin. By studying its DNA, scientists estimate that humans began wearing clothing around 100,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. This line of evidence converges with the archaeological hints of hide-working tools suggesting that the shift was underway during this time. It is a remarkable detail, not the garments themselves, but the creatures that feed on them preserve the memory of this quiet transformation. The lice mark the divide between nakedness and covering, between dependence on the body's own heat and the invention of a second portable layer of protection. The environment gives shape to this necessity. Nights on the plains are not always brutal, yet variation is constant. Dry seasons bring cool winds and star-chilled air. Rainy seasons can be damp and penetrating. In caves and shelters, groups gather around fire-tending embers, stretching hides, chipping stone. A rhythm emerges, hunt, butcher, skin, scrape, dry. These actions repeat until they become tradition, not merely tasks but embedded knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Children watch as adults scrape hides with stone flakes. The scraping sound steady, deliberate, producing flakes of dried flesh and hair. Hands rub fat into the hide to soften it, smoke it over low fires to preserve it. Each action alters the texture, transforming a stiff, raw skin into something pliable. At first, coverings may be heavy, awkward, carrying the smell of smoke and animal fat. But function outweighs form, and survival ensures their persistence. The human body itself tells a parallel story. Unlike Neanderthals, who had stockier builds adapted to cold early Homo sapiens, retained the long, lean proportions shaped by evolution in warmer climates. Narrower bodies shed heat well in hot conditions, but lose it quickly in the cold. Without coverings, these bodies are vulnerable. Clothing, therefore, becomes not only a cultural invention, but a physiological necessity as humans venture into marginal environments. Wrapped hides compensate for slender frames, extending the range of habitation far beyond the equatorial belt. What begins as protection against chill soon becomes an enabler of migration. Each hide draped over a body represents a small expansion of possibility. A few more nights endured in harsher conditions, a few more steps into new territories. The plains themselves carry the marks of transition. Herds of antelope graze their hides, thick against predators and cold. Lions and hyenas watch from shadows, and humans join the hunt, not only for meat, but for the coverings that animals provide. Each encounter with prey is doubled in value. The skin is no longer discarded, it is gathered, carefully treated with knowledge refined across seasons. The fire crackles, sparks rising into the dark, and the smell of curing hides drifts across encampments. Nights once spent shivering become more bearable. Infants survive, elders endure. Slowly, without fanfare, humanity begins to weave survival into skin and sinew. In this way, the first chapter of clothing is not about fashion or even adornment, but about endurance. It is born in necessity, in the bite of cold air and the whisper of wind across open grasslands. It is the outcome of countless small gestures, scraping, softening, tying. And though the forms are crude, the principle is profound. For the first time, humans carry with them a defense that is portable, renewable, shaped by their own hands. They begin to step into a world that demands more than warmth from fire and shelter from caves. They begin to carry their environment with them, stitched in skins, bound in sinew. This quiet shift, invisible in the vast expanse of time, becomes one of the foundations of the human journey. The nights stretch on one after another under star-filled skies. Across the grasslands, groups huddle in shelters, fires burning, low hides pulled close around shoulders. The chill of the air still presses in, but it no longer rules entirely. In these moments, the seeds of migration, of expansion into distant lands are planted. What begins with a hide across the back will in time enable humans to cross mountains, tundra, and steppe. The story of clothing begins here with cold nights on ancient plains, with survival stitched in silence, and with a new horizon opening just beyond the reach of the firelight. In the glow of campfires, where shadows dance against rough walls of stone, and smoke drifts slowly upward into the night, another sound joins the crackling of burning wood, the steady rasp of stone against hide. Humans sit close together, scraping skins taken from animals, their movements deliberate, almost meditative. The hides must be cleaned before they stiffen and rot. Fat and flesh cling to them, hair still thick across the surface. The stone flakes, sharp-edged and shaped by human hands, are drawn again and again across the surface, lifting curls of waste that fall to the ground. The rhythm of scraping is one of the oldest human labours, carried out with quiet persistence as sparks fly upward and darkness presses in. Fire provides warmth, but not permanence. When flames die, the cold returns creeping in from the edges of the night. Hides, however, can endure beyond a single blaze, making the task of scraping essential for survival. Each stroke of stone transforms skin from a raw remnant into a tool of endurance. Archaeological finds reveal this story indirectly. Hide scrapers are among the earliest tools discovered from this period, their edges worn smooth by repeated contact with animal skins. These tools appear across Africa and later in Eurasia, small yet unmistakable signs of human ingenuity. Their purpose was not to cut flesh for eating, but to prepare skins for wear. Such evidence provides a glimpse of a vanished world, for the hides themselves do not survive. Yet the tools, silent and enduring, carry memory of the gestures that once shaped them. In the marks left behind, one can imagine the people gathered in firelight, their hands busy their survival, tied to the transformation of animal remains into protective layers. The work of scraping hides is demanding. Fat is smeared across hands, hairs cling to skin, and the odour of blood lingers. Yet these labours are repeated across generations, woven into daily rhythm. Children watch, learning the motions, understanding that each stroke of stone means warmth through the cold night. Groups who master this skill endure. Those who fail risk shivering nights and shortened lives. Knowledge is survival, and survival is memory carried forward. In this way, the scraping of hides becomes more than labour. It becomes tradition, encoded in the collective habits of communities, linking present effort to future endurance. The process does not end with scraping. Once cleaned hides must be softened. They're stretched over frames or pulled taut between stakes rubbed with fat to preserve flexibility, sometimes smoked over fires to harden against decay. The smell of smoke mingles with the scent of hide, creating a sensory memory that lingers across time. Archaeological traces of such activities remain faint, but indirect clues abound. Microscopic analysis of ancient tools reveals residues of fat and collagen, where patterns confirm repeated use against tough animal skins. These fragments of evidence pieced together illuminate a world otherwise invisible, a world in which the manipulation of hides was not exceptional, but routine. The act of preparing hides also speaks to human relationship with animals. Hunts are not only for meat, but also for coverings. Every kill provides multiple resources: flesh for food, bones for tools, sinew for bindings, and hides for warmth. Nothing is wasted. This multifaceted use reflects deep ecological knowledge and ability to transform the body of an animal into a set of survival strategies. In this sense, hides bridge the gap between human vulnerability and environmental harshness. They allow slender, tropical adapted bodies to withstand cooler nights, expanding the range of places where humans can live. Without hides, fires alone cannot suffice, for flames burn out and cannot travel with the body. A scraped and softened hide, however, becomes a portable extension of human skin, a movable fire that shields from chill wherever one goes. The archaeological record further suggests that hide scraping marks one of the earliest shifts towards systematic clothing production. Though crude by later standards, these coverings represent a leap in adaptation. Where once only shelter and fire stood between humans and cold, now an additional layer of technology emerges. This transition is subtle yet profound. It does not arrive suddenly, nor does it spread with dramatic speed. Instead, it accumulates gradually embedded in everyday labour. The scraping of hides, repeated endlessly, creates the foundation for what clothing will become. Such tasks likely carried social dimensions as well. Around fires, scraping could be communal, with multiple hands working on hides, while stories or memories are shared. In these settings, knowledge is reinforced. Older individuals pass down techniques younger ones practice under watchful eyes. Through repetition, skills are preserved. Over time, scraping becomes more efficient hides, more durable coverings, more comfortable. What begins as rough labour evolves into practice craft. Each generation inherits the ability to endure climates harsher than their ancestors could have imagined. The presence of hide scrapers at archaeological sites also provides insight into human migration. As groups moved into cooler regions, the necessity of clothing grew stronger. Without coverings, expansion into temperate or glacial zones would have been impossible. The spread of hide-working tools parallels the spread of humans themselves, marking the technological threshold that enabled broader dispersals. Though fire had allowed earlier expansions, it was limited by its static nature. Clothing born of scraped hides extended mobility. This new flexibility transformed human relationship with environment, making once hostile landscapes habitable. In reflecting on this early stage of clothing, it becomes clear that the process was not glamorous, nor was it intended to be. The hides were heavy, likely odorous, often stiff despite efforts to soften them. Yet their utility outweighed discomfort. They served as shields against wind and night air, ensuring survival through seasons when bare skin would fail. Their presence also began to alter perception of the human body itself. No longer entirely exposed, the body became partly hidden, partly shaped by coverings. The boundary between skin and world was no longer direct, but mediated through layers of animal material scraped and prepared with care. In this shift lies the foundation of human culture's later complexity. What begins as necessity slowly opens the possibility of variation, of experimentation, of symbolic addition. But in these earliest moments, it remains rooted in survival. The fire burns low, sparks ascending, and the scraping sound continues into the night. The people gathered in its glow may not recognize the significance of what they're doing, yet their actions lay the groundwork for one of humanity's most enduring technologies. The landscape bears witness to these labors. Plains stretch outward, dotted with shelters and campsites. Herds move across the horizon, pursued by hunters whose tools are both weapons and scrapers. The rhythm of life is tied to migration of animals, to the gathering of resources, to the endless cycle of preparing hides for use. Each hide scraped by firelight is a link in a chain of survival that extends far beyond the moment. Though the evidence left behind is fragmentary, the continuity of practice speaks across millennia. The silent stone tools worn by use remain as testament to these ancient labours. In this way, the scraping of hides marks a subtle but critical stage in the story of clothing. It is not the invention of sewing nor the adornment of garments, but it is the essential beginning. In the rasp of stone on skin lies the first human attempt to make the environment wearable. In the persistence of this practice lies the survival of entire communities, and in the memory of stone tools still resting beneath layers of earth lies the enduring trace of firelit nights when scraping hides meant the difference between life and death. As hide scraping becomes a steady rhythm of survival, another dimension of craft begins to unfold, the shaping of tools dedicated to the softening of skins. Across scattered campsites, stone flakes evolve into more specialized instruments, their forms reflecting a growing mastery of hide work. Awls appear, pointed implements fashioned from bone or antler, slender yet durable, capable of piercing tough material. These are not weapons, but tools of preparation designed to open holes to stretch fibers to aid in the transformation of raw hide into something more pliable. Alongside them lie scrapers of varied shapes, some with convex edges for broad strokes, others with narrow points for delicate work. Each design tells of experimentation of hands refining methods over countless repetitions. The archaeological record preserves these innovations in stone and bone, though the hides themselves are long vanished. Their absence is filled by inference that the presence of such tools found in contexts of hunting and habitation reflects a deeper engagement with animal skins than food alone. The softening of hides is essential for untreated skins stiffen as they dry, becoming hard and brittle. To be worn, they must bend and yield to movement. Humans learn to stretch them taut, to rub them with fat, to smoke them over low fires. The process is laborious, requiring patience and persistence. Each step carries knowledge how long to smoke without burning, how to stretch without tearing, how to rub in fat until the fibers loosen. Such skills are not instinctive, but taught shared across generations, embedded into communal memory. Through this work, hides shift from burdensome remnants to wearable layers. What was once discarded waste becomes valued resource, marking a profound shift in human adaptation. Bone awls in particular signal an important stage in this development. Small, polished and pointed, they are found at sites tens of thousands of years old, their surfaces worn smooth from repeated piercing of hide. These tools allow holes to be made without tearing, enabling hides to be joined, laced or bound together. Even before the invention of true sewing, such piercing permits a crude form of assembly. Hides can be tied with sinew through holes shaped to fit more closely around the body, secured against slipping away. In this sense, bone awls prefigure the tailored garments that will come later. They are humble beginnings, but they expand the possibilities of clothing beyond draped skins alone. The emergence of specialized hide-working tools also speaks to an increasing investment of time and labor in clothing production. These are not incidental acts carried out in spare moments, but deliberate tasks requiring preparation and planning. Scrapers must be napped awls, fashioned hides gathered and processed. Each step builds on the next, creating a chain of interdependent tasks that culminate in usable coverings. Such organization reflects the broader complexity of human life at this time. Communities coordinate hunts not only for food, but for the materials needed to survive cold nights. Division of labor may emerge, with some focusing on tool production, others on scraping, still others on hunting. Around fires, these strands converge, weaving survival into collective effort. The landscapes in which these tools are found also tell part of the story. In Africa, sites such as Blombos Cave and others of similar age contain evidence of bone tools alongside ochre and shell beads, hinting at a growing spectrum of symbolic and practical behavior. The presence of hide-working tools in these contexts suggests that clothing was part of a broader expansion of human adaptation, linking material survival to cultural development. Though hides themselves are absent, the awls and scrapers lie in layers of earth, as silent witnesses marking the threshold where clothing begins to move from crude draping toward more fitted forms. Softened hides provide more than warmth. They also create comfort, allowing greater mobility in daily tasks. A stiff, untreated hide may insulate, but it restricts movement, impedes walking, burdens the body. A softened hide bends with the wearer, permitting hunting, gathering, traveling. This flexibility transforms clothing from a passive shield into an active tool integrated with movement. In this sense, the development of hide softening techniques expands the potential of clothing beyond survival alone. It allows humans not merely to endure but to function effectively in varied environments, to move farther to work longer, to inhabit more demanding landscapes. The presence of such tools also suggests a growing cognitive investment in planning for the future. Unlike immediate consumption of food, hide preparation requires delayed reward. Scraping, softening, piercing these labours are undertaken not for instant gain, but for benefits that come later when the nights grow colder, when journeys stretch long. In committing time to this work, humans demonstrate foresight, patience, and collective organisation. The tools themselves embody this investment, durable objects intended for repeated use. Their survival across millennia attests to their central role in daily life, carried from camp to camp, employed in countless acts of preparation. The process of softening hides also reveals intimate engagement with the environment. Knowledge of which animals provide the best skins, of which fats preserve hides, most effectively of which woods produce the right smoke, all reflect deep ecological understanding. This knowledge is not abstract but embodied, carried in the hands and senses of those who work the hides. It is knowledge learned by doing, reinforced by necessity, repeated until it becomes tradition. In this way, the making of clothing becomes a dialogue with the landscape, a way of drawing resilience from its resources. As humans refine these techniques, the boundary between necessity and possibility begins to blur. Hides may first be processed for warmth, but once softened, they invite variation. Some may be cut smaller for children, others tied differently for hunters needing freedom of movement. Over time, such adjustments open pathways toward experimentation, toward adornment, toward the symbolic uses of clothing that will emerge later. In this sense, the invention of specialized hideworking tools is not only a practical advance, but a seed for future cultural developments. In the steady rasp of stone and the piercing motion of bone awls, one hears the beginnings of a quiet revolution. These tools are not dramatic in form, not monumental like later structures or artifacts. They are small, unassuming, yet they carry immense weight in the human story. They represent the moment when survival began to depend not only on fire and shelter, but on garments shaped by deliberate craft. They mark the shift from temporary improvisation to sustained technological practice. They anchor the story of clothing in the patient work of hands at the edge of firelight. Thus, the invention and refinement of scrapers and awls signal more than technical ingenuity. They embody the slow accumulation of knowledge, the deepening of human engagement with materials, the expansion of survival strategies into new realms. Through them, hides cease to be crude coverings and become shaped, softened, adapted to the body. Through them, the human journey toward clothing takes its next step, quiet, but enduring in the long arc of adaptation across landscapes vast and changing. Among the earliest signs of deliberate tailoring in human history lies a simple yet profound tool, the bone needle. Fashioned with care, polished until smooth-tipped to a fine point, and sometimes drilled with a tiny eye for threading sinew or fibre, these needles represent one of the quiet breakthroughs of human technology. Their appearance in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago signals a moment when clothing ceases to be a mere draping of hides and begins to be something fitted, shaped, and constructed. The difference is subtle at first glance, yet immense in consequence. Where scraped and softened hides draped loosely across the shoulders provide warmth, stitched garments hug the body, free the hands, and allow movement with greater ease, they transform clothing from makeshift covering into crafted apparel. Bone needles survive in only a handful of sites, for they are fragile, easily broken, and rare in preservation. Yet their discovery in caves across Eurasia and Africa offers glimpses of a world where sewing had become a practice skill. Some of the earliest examples come from Siberia, dating back around 50,000 years, with evidence suggesting even earlier origins in Africa. These delicate tools are marvels of precision for their age, their fine tips capable of piercing hide cleanly, their eyes drilled with remarkable steadiness. The hands that made them were steady, the minds behind them inventive, capable of seeing in bone not merely a remnant of a hunt, but a new instrument of survival. The act of shaping a needle required patience selecting bone or antler, grinding it into slender form polishing to prevent tearing fibers, drilling an eye with tools of stone. The process itself reflects a leap in technological imagination, transforming raw material into an object of remarkable utility. With needles came stitching, and with stitching came fitted clothing. Strips of sinew or plant fibre could be threaded through pierced holes, drawing edges of hide, together binding them securely. Simple tunics, leggings, or wraps could be fashioned tailored to individual bodies, rather than draped indiscriminately. Such garments did more than provide warmth. They allowed efficient movement across landscapes, enabling long hunts, extended migrations, and greater resilience against wind and snow. A stitched garment is lighter than a heavy draped hide, more flexible, easier to carry. It represents efficiency, a refinement of survival strategy. Archaeological evidence also suggests that the invention of sewing may have occurred independently in different regions. The appearance of bone needles in multiple sites points to a convergence of necessity and creativity. Wherever climates demanded more efficient clothing, humans responded with innovation. In this way, the bone needle becomes a marker not of one isolated invention, but of a broader capacity for technological problem-solving, a trait deeply characteristic of Homo sapiens. The spread of needles mirrors the spread of people themselves as groups expanded into colder latitudes where draped hides no longer sufficed. In these environments, sewing was not luxury but necessity. The making of bone needles also reveals the interplay of skill and tradition. Needles are delicate, they break easily if mishandled. To produce them reliably requires knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. Children may have practiced with simpler tools before attempting the refinement of needle-making. The success of sewing thus depends not only on invention, but on teaching on the continuity of craft across time. Each surviving needle embodies not just ingenuity but pedagogy, the transfer of skill within communities. This continuity allows techniques to spread, refine, and persist, weaving technological progress into the fabric of culture itself. The use of sewing transforms the experience of clothing. A stitched garment lies closer to the body, conserving heat more efficiently. It also allows layering multiple pieces worn together, adjusted according to conditions. Such adaptability expands the range of climates in which humans can thrive. In glacial Europe or Siberian steppes, fitted clothing becomes a shield against frost and wind, enabling habitation of regions where naked skin and simple hides would quickly fail. In this sense, the needle is not merely a small tool, it is a passport into new worlds. Its invention underwrites the great expansions of Homo sapiens into territories once closed by cold. Needles also open the door to creativity and form. Once hides can be joined and shaped, garments need not remain crude. Variations emerge, different cuts, different fastenings, adjustments for age, gender, or task. A hunter may require fitted leggings for mobility, while an infant is wrapped in softer stitched coverings. The capacity to shape clothing introduces diversity, and diversity introduces identity. In time, this will give rise to symbolic adornment to clothing as expression as much as protection, but in its earliest form it remains grounded in survival, a technology born of cold winds and long nights, carried forward by hands working bone into tools of endurance. The archaeological silence around actual garments underscores the importance of needles as proxies. Leather and fibre rot vanishing into soil, leaving little trace. Yet the needles endure, slender artifacts that speak volumes. Their presence in sites far from Africa suggests not only their invention but their portability. Needles were carried across journeys, treasured, repaired, perhaps even exchanged between groups. Their portability reflects their value, for a needle multiplies the utility of every hide. It is a tool of transformation, turning raw material into tailored covering, crude survival into efficient adaptation. In this sense, the bone needle stands among the quiet but foundational inventions of humanity, equal in significance to fire or stone blades in its impact on the trajectory of survival. In reflecting on these earlier stitches, one senses the intimacy of the process. Around fires, hides are laid out awls, and scrapers prepare the material, and needles pierce hide edge to edge. Sinew pulls tight, drawing seams together, creating garments that hold against wind. The sounds are soft, scraping, piercing, threading, yet the outcome is profound. Clothing shifts from temporary drape to permanent construction. Communities huddle in shelters clad in stitched hides, moving across landscapes with new confidence. Infants are swaddled more securely, hunters stride with freer movement, elders endure longer against chill. The cumulative effect of these small stitches is nothing less than the expansion of human possibility. The invention of the needle also marks a threshold in human relationship with materials. It demonstrates not only the shaping of tools, but the shaping of textiles, an engagement with flexible, pliable resources that anticipates weaving, spinning, and the vast textile traditions to come. It is the beginning of a long story in which humans manipulate fibres and fabrics to create environments for themselves, environments worn on the body. From the moment the first sinew was pulled through hide with a bone needle, the trajectory toward clothing as an art and identity was set. In the stillness of ancient caves, needles rest buried in sediment, their points dulled by time, their eyes empty of thread. Yet they speak of hands that once held them, eyes that once squinted in firelight to guide sinew through tiny holes, bodies once clothed in garments that carried them across cold plains. The bone needle is humble, fragile, easy to overlook, yet it embodies a vast change. It is the tool that stitched humanity into new landscapes, that carried warmth beyond the reach of fire, that marked the true beginning of clothing as craft. With each stitch, humans bound themselves more closely to survival, but also more closely to the unfolding story of culture, invention, and adaptation. One of the most unusual strands of evidence for the origins of clothing does not come from tools or bones or cave deposits, but from parasites, tiny creatures that have lived alongside humans for millennia. The body louse, a close relative of the head louse, survives only in clothing and not on bare skin. By tracing the genetic divergence between head lice and body, lice scientists have reconstructed the timeline of when humans first began to wear clothes regularly. The findings suggest a date of at least 100,000 years ago, possibly earlier. In this way, clothing leaves its signature not in the fabric that decays, but in the genomes of creatures that fed on those fabrics. This indirect evidence, as strange as it seems, is among the most reliable markers of when humans crossed the threshold into consistent use of garments. The reasoning is elegant. Head lice, like their ancestors, live in human hair, clinging to shafts and feeding on blood. At some point, a population of these lice shifted its habitat, moving into the folds and seams of clothing. This adaptation could only occur once clothing became a stable part of human life. Occasional hides thrown over shoulders would not suffice, for lice require consistent environments to reproduce and thrive. Their existence in clothing reflects not temporary coverings but permanent daily wear. Genetic studies show that body lice split from head lice roughly around the time Homo sapiens were beginning to spread beyond Africa. This aligns with the archaeological hints of hide-working tools and bone needles, reinforcing the picture of clothing as a transformative technology of this era. The significance of lice evidence lies in its independence from material remains. While hides and fibers rot, parasites endure. Their DNA carries echoes of human behavior across vast stretches of time. In studying the humble Laos, scientists have illuminated a key moment in cultural evolution, one otherwise invisible to the archaeological record. The irony is striking. One of humanity's oldest discomforts becomes one of its most informative allies in reconstructing prehistory. Each Laos genome is a microscopic record of clothing's emergence, preserving a story that leather scraps and fibers could not. The emergence of body lice suggests that clothing had become indispensable by this time, not only for warmth, but also as a consistent part of human existence. Groups living in varying climates, facing unpredictable seasons, must have relied heavily on garments. For body lice to establish themselves, clothing would have been worn nearly constantly, forming a new environment for both humans and their parasites. This marks a shift in daily life where clothing is no longer optional, but integral. The skin is now almost always covered, the body encased not only for warmth, but as a habitat shared with creatures drawn to seams and folds. The presence of body lice also carries implications for migration. By the time these parasites had fully adapted to clothing, humans were beginning to move into regions far colder than their African homelands. The lice timeline coincides with evidence of dispersal into Eurasia, suggesting that clothing was essential for such expansions. Without garments, survival in temperate and glacial zones would have been impossible. The parasites unwittingly confirm that humans had equipped themselves for journeys into colder worlds. Clothing becomes the hidden engine of migration, enabling people to step into environments that had long been closed to them. In considering this evidence, it becomes clear how intertwined humans are with the smallest forms of life. The story of clothing is not told solely by human artifacts, but by the organisms that adapted to human habits. Just as dogs and livestock later became companions and resources, lice became uninvited partners, their fate bound to the garments humans created. The lice did not change human survival strategies, but they recorded them, leaving genetic timestamps that scientists can read tens of thousands of years later. In this sense, the parasites function as accidental archivists of human history, preserving in their DNA what the Earth could not. The study of lice also underscores the global nature of this transition. Head lice are found in populations worldwide, while body lice reflect the spread of clothing alongside human dispersal. As groups migrated into new regions, they carried not only their tools and traditions, but also their parasites. The lice travelled within the seams of garments, invisible yet persistent, following humans across continents. Their global distribution today echoes those early movements, their diversity mirroring the paths of ancient migration. In this way, even the spread of disease and discomfort traces the expansion of clothing and the migrations it enabled. While lice evidence is compelling, it also highlights the absence of other direct traces. Rarely do archaeologists find preserved clothing from deep prehistory, for organic materials decay rapidly. Only under exceptional conditions, frozen ice, dry caves, or peat bogs, do fragments endure. For the period around 100,000 years ago, such preservation is nearly non-existent. In this absence, indirect evidence becomes vital. Tools, residues, and parasites form a mosaic that points to the same conclusion. Humans had embraced clothing as essential technology. Each strand of evidence reinforces the others, weaving a consistent story out of fragments. The perspective offered by lice also prompts reflection on the relationship between necessity and innovation. Clothing was not invented for adornment, but for survival. It arose in response to cold, to wind, to the bite of air at night. Yet its invention had unintended consequences, among them the creation of new ecological niches for parasites. Every innovation opens unforeseen pathways, shaping not only human life, but the lives of other species. In this sense, the history of clothing is inseparable from the history of all organisms entwined with humans. From lice to livestock, from wolves to fibers, human adaptation draws others into its orbit. The tiny body louse therefore stands as unlikely witness to one of humanity's quiet revolutions. In its genome lies the record of when clothing became a permanent companion, when bare skin gave way to stitched and softened hides, when humans began to live not only with fire and shelter, but with garments that carried their warmth wherever they travelled. The parasites may have brought irritation and disease, but they also carried memory, ensuring that the invention of clothing would not be lost to the silence of decay. In the grand sweep of prehistory, the moment when lice diverged may seem small, yet it marks a turning point. From this time onward, humans are clothed creatures distinguished not only by tools and fire, but by coverings that shape daily life. Clothing becomes as integral as language or art, woven into the definition of what it means to be human, and in the quiet persistence of parasites, the memory of this transformation endures, whispering across time that the dawn of clothing was both an act of survival and the beginning of a new relationship between humans and the world they shaped around themselves. The spread of ice sheets during the Pleistocene casts a long shadow across the human story. Around 100,000 years ago, Earth is locked in cycles of glaciation, great masses of frozen water advancing and retreating across the northern hemisphere. These movements are not steady but rhythmic, rising and falling like tides over tens of thousands of years. When the ice sheets expand, vast areas of Europe, Asia and North America vanish beneath frozen surfaces. Sea levels drop as water is locked away, exposing continental shelves and altering coastlines. Winds shift, rainfall patterns change, deserts spread and grasslands dry. Even far from the glaciers themselves, climates grow cooler, harsher, more unpredictable. In Africa, where Homo sapiens originate, cooler and drier conditions alter the landscape, stretching savannas, shrinking forests, reducing freshwater sources. The survival of human communities becomes precarious. It is in this climatic crucible that clothing becomes indispensable. Fire shelter and community had long sustained humans, but as nights grew colder and seasons harsher, new strategies were required. The pressure of glaciation did not press evenly. It rippled outward, reshaping environments across continents. Temperatures fluctuated, rainfall diminished, and ecological niches shifted. Animals moved in response, and humans followed, adjusting their habits, their movements, and their tools. Yet without the protection of hides shaped into garments, many of these movements would have been impossible. Clothing emerges not as luxury, but as lifeline, the buffer between vulnerable skin and a world increasingly hostile. Archaeological evidence from this time shows a parallel development of technologies suited to cold environments. In addition to hide scrapers and bone awls, sites yield hearths, with repeated layers of ash, evidence of fire maintained over long periods. The effort to keep warmth continuous reflects a climate where survival depended on endurance. Yet fire alone could not suffice. Flames burn out embers cool and nights stretch long. Clothing by contrast travels with the body. It preserves warmth through the hours of hunting, gathering and migration. It makes survival portable. In this sense, clothing and fire together form a twin technology, each compensating for the limits of the other. The pressure of glaciation also sharpens the contrast between species. Neanderthals living in Europe and Western Asia are well adapted to cold, their stocky bodies retaining heat more effectively. Homo sapiens with leaner builds suited to warmer climates faced greater vulnerability as they ventured into colder regions. For them, clothing was not optional, but essential. Where Neanderthal physiology offered natural insulation, Homo sapiens required cultural and technological compensation. The reliance on clothing becomes a defining trait of our species, shaping not only survival, but migration patterns. It allows expansion into environments that would otherwise be closed, transforming humans into adaptable generalists, capable of thriving across a vast range of climates. The rhythm of the ice ages also influences the tempo of migration. During warmer interglacial phases, humans expand, exploring new regions, pushing into lands newly hospitable. During colder phases, retreats and consolidations occur, groups clustering in refuges where resources remain. Clothing plays a role in both expansions and retreats, offering insulation in colder refuges and flexibility in cooler open landscapes. The pressure of climate ensures that garments are not abandoned once invented, but become woven into the fabric of daily life. Even when temperatures ease, the habit persists, reinforced by necessity and passed across generations. Climate also shapes the animals available for hides. During glacial phases, herds of cold-adapted mammals dominate northern landscapes, mammoth woolly rhinoceros reindeer. Their thick skins offer excellent insulation, yet require skill to process. The hides of mammoth, for example, are heavy and unwieldy, demanding careful scraping and softening to become usable. The labour involved reflects the increasing complexity of hide preparation, where specialised tools such as scrapers and needles grow indispensable. Each new climate, each new animal presents challenges that foster innovation. Clothing evolves in dialogue with both climate and prey, shaped by necessity refined through practice. In Africa, though, glaciers never advanced, the indirect effects were profound. Drying climates reduced forest cover and pushed savanna ecosystems into new configurations. Humans living in these shifting environments faced cold nights in arid highlands, unpredictable weather patterns, and the pressure to migrate in search of stable resources. Clothing even in these latitudes offered advantage, buffering against extremes of heat by day and cold by night. The universality of its utility ensured its persistence, spreading not only with migrations out of Africa, but also within diverse African landscapes themselves. The cycles of ice also frame the broader context of human dispersal. As sea levels dropped during glacial phases, land bridges appeared, opening pathways between continents. The Sinai Peninsula linked Africa and Eurasia, while the Bering Land Bridge later connected Asia and North America. These corridors became highways of migration, yet they traversed harsh environments. Without clothing, such journeys would have been perilous. Garments stitched from hides enabled humans to cross cold steppes, to endure winds sweeping across exposed plains, to persist in territories where shelter was scarce. In this way, the global movements of humans are inseparable from the quiet technology of clothing. The pressure exerted by glaciation also fostered cultural resilience. Communities that endured cold nights developed traditions around clothing, embedding the practice in ritual and memory. The scraping of hides, the stitching with sinew, The smoking of skins over fire all became habitual, taught to children as essential skills. In this way, climate not only shaped bodies but also minds, instilling foresight, patience, and communal cooperation. Clothing as a product of these habits reflects not only technological ingenuity, but cultural endurance, the ability to persist collectively through hardship. Glaciation, then, is not merely a backdrop to the story of clothing, but a catalyst. It creates the conditions under which garments become necessary. It drives the innovations that refine hide working, and it shapes the migrations that carry humans across continents. Without the pressure of cold, the invention of clothing might have been delayed or taken other forms. With it, clothing becomes one of the most defining adaptations of Homo sapiens, enabling survival in environments that would otherwise remain inaccessible. These cycles of ice, relentless and vast, draw humans into a dialogue with climate, a dialogue answered in part through the invention of garments. In this way, the expansion of ice sheets is not only a geological event, but a cultural one. It inscribes itself on human behavior, pushing communities to innovate, to adapt, to create coverings that carry warmth beyond the reach of fire. Each garment stitched in firelight, each hide softened with fat and smoke reflects the weight of glacial pressure pressing across continents. The survival of humanity in this epoch is not merely a story of endurance, but of ingenuity, of transforming necessity into invention. And at the heart of that invention lies clothing born in response to the vast silent advance of ice, carried forward into every corner of the inhabited world. Groups began to move beyond the relative warmth of Africa and into the harsher lands of Eurasia. The limits of bare skin and simple draped hides became starkly clear. Nights lengthened, winters deepened, and winds cut more sharply across open plains. To endure, humans needed more than firelight and temporary shelters. They needed coverings that travelled with them, layers of warmth bound to their bodies, as protection against the unforgiving climates of new regions. The migration into northern latitudes thus became a story, written not only in footprints and stone tools, but also in the invisible presence of garments stitched from animal skins. Archaeological evidence places Homo sapiens outside Africa by around 70,000 years ago, with subsequent dispersals spreading across the Middle East into South Asia and eventually into Europe and Northern Asia. Each step along these journeys brought people into landscapes colder than their ancestral homelands. In the Levant, winters could chill more deeply than in Africa. In Central Asia, temperatures plunged well below freezing, and in the vast steppes of Siberia, cold dominated nearly every season. Without clothing, such movements would have been impossible. The evidence of hide-working tools and bone needles from sites in these regions suggests that migrants carried with them not only fire and stone blades, but also the knowledge of garment making. These technologies were as essential as weapons for hunting, for they enabled survival in climates that otherwise would have closed their doors to human presence. The ecological diversity of Eurasia underscores the importance of clothing in this expansion. To the south, groups encountered semi-arid deserts, where clothing shielded them from daytime heat, as well as nighttime chill. To the north, forests and tundra demanded insulation from snow and ice. The adaptability of clothing lies in its variability. Hides could be layered for warmth, lightened for mobility, adjusted for children and elders alike. In this way, garments became as flexible as the humans who wore them, responding to changing environments with subtle adjustments. Clothing thus functioned as an adaptive bridge, allowing a single species to inhabit deserts, plains, forests, and frozen steppes within a few millennia. The migrations into northern latitudes also reveal the interplay between clothing and other survival strategies. Fire remained vital, but without clothing, fire alone could not suffice in open landscapes. Shelter too became crucial. Caves, huts, and windbreaks offered reprieve from the elements, but these were immobile, tied to place. Clothing, by contrast, was mobile. It allowed movement between fires, between shelters, across vast expanses of exposed terrain. It enabled hunting in the snow, gathering in frosty mornings, travelling under grey winter skies. In this sense, clothing extended the reach of both fire and shelter, binding together the core elements of human survival into a portable package. As humans expanded northward, their relationship with animals deepened. Large herbivores such as reindeer, bison, and mammoth provided not only meat but also hides thick enough to insulate against cold. Processing these hides demanded skill, for they were heavy and resistant. Scrapers refined their surfaces, fat softened their fibers, smoke preserved their durability. Needles stitched them into tailored garments shaped to fit bodies more snugly, conserving heat efficiently. In this way, the animals of the north became more than prey. They became partners in survival, their skins wrapped around human bodies, carrying warmth from one species to another. Clothing thus reflects an intimate ecological entanglement, a merging of human and animal existence in the shared effort to endure the cold. The archaeological silence on actual garments is filled by indirect traces that map onto these migrations. At sites in Siberia and Central Asia, finely crafted needles suggest clothing of considerable sophistication, capable of withstanding extreme cold. The presence of beads and ochre alongside these tools hints that clothing may already have carried symbolic meaning, though its first and most urgent function remained survival. At rock shelters in Europe, cut marks on animal bones indicate systematic skinning practices suggesting hides were prized as much as flesh. Taken together, these clues reveal a pattern as humans moved northward. Clothing was not an afterthought, but a central pillar of adaptation. The spread of clothing also altered the tempo of human movement. Without garments, humans would have been confined largely to equatorial belts, limited in expansion by the boundaries of climate. With clothing, those boundaries blurred. People could cross mountain passes, linger in cold valleys, traverse snowy plains. Each seam stitched in firelight opened a corridor across landscapes previously closed. Migration became less about waiting for favourable climates, and more about carrying favourable climates along. Clothing functioned as a portable environment, a microclimate wrapped around the body, allowing humans to dictate the terms of their survival, rather than being dictated entirely by geography. The psychological implications of this adaptation are harder to trace but equally profound. With garments, humans carried a sense of preparedness, of security in the face of unpredictable weather. A storm or sudden freeze no longer spelled immediate danger if hides could be pulled tighter, seams reinforced, layers added. This resilience in turn encouraged exploration, pushing groups farther into unknown lands, confident that their technology could buffer the risks. In this way, clothing not only enabled migration physically, but also emboldened it mentally, fostering a culture of movement, of seeking new horizons, even under cold skies. The spread into northern latitudes also laid the groundwork for further innovations. Once clothing became standard, it was natural to refine its forms, to experiment with layering to adjust garments for specialized tasks. Hunters might develop coverings that allowed stealth and mobility, while gatherers shaped garments for carrying loads. Over time, such differentiation encouraged the diversification of clothing styles even before adornment became widespread. The necessity of clothing thus seeded the possibility of variation, which in turn would later blossom into expressions of identity and culture. From a broad perspective, the movement into colder latitudes marks the point at which clothing becomes not merely a local adaptation, but a global necessity. as groups spread across Eurasia into forests, tundra, and steppe garments stitched from hides became as essential as tools for hunting or fire for warmth. Without them, dispersals would have faltered, groups would have retreated, expansion would have stalled. With them, humanity crossed thresholds of climate and geography, stepping into worlds where no primate had ever lived before. Clothing thus stands at the heart of one of the great human transformations, the transition from species bound to warmth to species unbound, capable of inhabiting nearly any climate on Earth. In the quiet work of sewing by firelight, in the rasp of scraper against hide, in the patience of piercing and threading lies the story of this expansion. It is not a story of conquest, but of endurance, not of sudden leaps, but of steady adaptation. Northern winds blew cold, yet humans carried warmth stitched into their garments. Ice and snow covered the land, yet humans walked across them, clothed in the skins of animals, carrying their own crafted environments with them. In each step northward, the presence of clothing is implicit, invisible in the archaeological layers, yet undeniable in its necessity. The migration into northern latitudes is thus inseparable from the invention of garments, a testament to the quiet power of technology to reshape the possibilities of human life. As Homo sapiens spread into Eurasia, they encountered another human lineage that had already adapted to the cold, the Neanderthals. Stocky and broad-bodied Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before the arrival of modern humans. Their shorter limbs and barrel chests conserved heat, an evolutionary answer to the rigours of glacial climates. Unlike the leaner frames of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals carried a physiology shaped by the demands of cold environments. Yet even their robust bodies could not face winter without aid. The archaeological record strongly suggests that Neanderthals too made use of animal hides, draping or fastening them to shield themselves from frost. In the caves where they lived, cut marks on animal bones reveal skinning practices similar to those of Homo sapiens. Tools fashioned from stone and bone show wear consistent with scraping hides. Though no garments survive, the indirect evidence paints a clear picture. Neanderthals, like modern humans, turned to clothing as part of their survival strategy. The question of how their clothing differed from that of Homo sapiens remains open. Neanderthals certainly had the capacity to process hides, as demonstrated by specialized scrapers found at their sites. Yet the presence of bone needles, those delicate instruments of stitching, is so far absent from Neanderthal contexts. This absence has led many researchers to suggest that their clothing may have been less fitted, relying on draped hides tied with sinew or thongs rather than sewn garments. Such coverings would have provided warmth but perhaps lacked the efficiency of stitched apparel. The difference, though subtle, could have had profound consequences. Fitted clothing conserves heat more effectively, particularly in extreme cold. It allows greater mobility, enabling long hunts and migrations. Neanderthals may have endured well in regions they knew, but Homo sapiens with tailored garments could expand more readily into harsher and more variable environments. This contrast should not be seen as a matter of superiority or deficiency, but of adaptation strategies. Neanderthals thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in climates where survival was never easy. Their use of hides, fire, and shelter demonstrates a profound knowledge of their landscapes. Yet Homo sapiens entering these same lands brought with them technologies that allowed flexibility and expansion. The needle, small and fragile, may have tipped the balance in favor of broader dispersal, enabling Homo sapiens to endure environments where draped hides might have proved insufficient. Clothing thus becomes one of the quiet distinctions between the two species, a factor that may have influenced their differing fates. The archaeological sites where Neanderthals lived provide glimpses of these practices. In caves across France, Spain and Central Europe, layers of habitation contain abundant stone tools, hearths, and animal remains. Among the bones, cut marks on skins show careful removal not just for meat but for hides. Where patterns on Mousterian scrapers align with the processing of thick animal skins, these indirect clues suggest a routine engagement with clothing even if garments themselves have vanished. Some researchers have speculated that Neanderthals may have worn capes, or poncho-like hides fastened at the shoulder or waist, simple yet effective in blocking cold winds. Such garments would have provided sufficient warmth in familiar territories, though perhaps limiting mobility and efficiency compared to the stitched clothing of Homo sapiens. The possibility of adornment among Neanderthals also invites reflection. Shell beads, pigments, and eagle talons found at certain sites suggest symbolic behaviour. If they adorn themselves with ornaments, it is possible that clothing too may have carried meaning beyond warmth. Ochre residues on hides could have coloured garments, or pierced shells may have been attached to skins as decoration. Though the evidence is sparse, it reminds us that clothing is never only about protection. Even in its earliest forms, it may also carry signals of identity, belonging, or status. The difference between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in this respect may not have been absolute, but the trajectory of Homo sapiens leaned more heavily toward elaboration, toward turning clothing into both shield and symbol. Comparing the two species through the lens of clothing also highlights the intersection of biology and culture. Neanderthals relied on their physiology, robust frames, and greater muscle mass to endure cold. Homo sapiens relied more heavily on culture, compensating for leaner bodies with garments shaped by needles and sinew. Both approaches worked within their own contexts, but culture-based adaptations offered greater flexibility. As climates shifted or as migrations carried groups into unfamiliar lands, clothing could be adjusted more readily than physiology. In this sense, the story of clothing reflects the broader human reliance on cultural innovation as a substitute for biological specialization. The overlap of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in Europe and Western Asia offers a window into these dynamics. For thousands of years, the two species shared landscapes, sometimes competing, sometimes interacting, even interbreeding. In cold valleys and snowy plains, both lit fires, scraped hides, and sought shelter in caves. Yet the subtle differences in their technologies may have shaped the outcomes of these encounters. Homo sapiens with fitted clothing could push farther into the cold, sustain longer hunts, and expand population ranges. Neanderthals adapted to specific regions may have been more constrained. In this view, clothing becomes not only a survival tool, but a factor in the shifting balance of human history. It is important to recognize, however, that the absence of needles in Neanderthal sites does not necessarily prove their absence from Neanderthal life. Bone needles are fragile and easily lost to time. Their discovery in Homo sapiens sites may reflect preservation bias rather than real difference. Still, the consistency of evidence across multiple sites lends weight to the hypothesis of differing clothing traditions. Whether draped or stitched, the garments of Neanderthals stand as testimony to their resilience, their ability to survive in environments that challenged every breath. The comparison of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens clothing strategies illustrates a deeper truth about humanity. Adaptation is never singular. Different solutions can achieve the same end shaped by biology, culture, and environment. In Neanderthals, one sees a lineage that endured through bodily strength and straightforward coverings. In Homo sapiens, one sees a lineage that embraced intricate tools and stitched garments. Both reveal ingenuity, both reflect survival, yet the trajectory of Homo sapiens, marked by cultural flexibility, would ultimately spread, farther persist, longer, and encompass the entire globe. In the quiet scraping of hides, in the draping of skins across shoulders, in the piercing of holes with bone awls, Neanderthals wove clothing into their daily lives. Around their hearths, as snow fell outside, caves' garments provided warmth and comfort, just as they did for Homo sapiens in other lands. The difference lay not in the need, but in the methods. One species tied hides, the other stitched them. One relied on bodily strength, the other on technological ingenuity. Both clothed themselves against the cold, but the balance of biology and culture tilted differently. In this comparison, the story of clothing becomes a story of two humanities overlapping in time yet diverging in destiny. Neanderthals remind us that there is more than one way to survive, more than one way to be human. Their garments, though lost to time, linger in the indirect traces of tools and bones, in the silent witness of caves where fires once burned. They show us that clothing is not only a Homo sapiens invention, but a shared inheritance of humankind, a testament to the universal need for warmth, endurance, and adaptation under the vast and changing skies of the Ice Age. Beyond the presence of Neanderthals, another lineage shadows the story of early clothing, the Denisovans. Their traces are few, scattered like whispers in the archaeological record, yet their existence is undeniable. Known primarily from fragments of bone and teeth found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, the Denisovans remain one of the most enigmatic branches of the human family. Genetic studies reveal their influence across Asia and Oceania, showing that they interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, leaving their legacy in the DNA of modern populations. But what of their daily lives, their survival strategies, their adaptations to cold? The cave that gave them their name lies in a region of harsh winters and frigid landscapes. To endure there without clothing would have been unthinkable. Though direct evidence is scarce, the very location of their remains implies that Denisovans too must have made use of garments fashioned from animal hides. The highlands of Siberia, where Denisova Cave sits, are unforgiving. Snow blankets the ground for long months, temperatures plunge far below freezing, and winds sweep across open plateaus. Any group inhabiting such terrain would require consistent insulation beyond fire and shelter. The stone tools found in Denisova Cave include scrapers suggesting hide processing. The absence of bone needles in the record may simply reflect preservation bias, as such fragile tools rarely survive. Yet by inference, the Denisovans must have developed strategies similar to their Neanderthal and Homo sapiens counterparts, scraping hides, softening them with fat perhaps, fastening them with thongs of sinew. Without these practices, the survival of a community in Siberia would have been impossible. Genetic evidence further strengthens the case for Denisovan adaptations to cold. Studies suggest they carried variants of genes linked to high-altitude survival traits, later passed on to populations living in the Tibetan Plateau. Such adaptations imply long residence in challenging environments where cold and thin air pressed constantly on human physiology. Clothing in such contexts would not have been optional. It would have formed part of a suite of survival strategies complementing biological adaptations, where genes shaped bodies for endurance garments shaped the external environment to soften its extremes. Together they allowed Denisovans to inhabit places that would have crushed unprotected humans. The mystery of Denisovan clothing lies in the silence of the archaeological record. Unlike Neanderthals, whose sites have yielded abundant tools and ornaments, Denisovans remain elusive. The few tools recovered from Denisova Cave point to technological competence but do not yet reveal the full breadth of their craft. Still, The logic of survival suggests that clothing was part of their repertoire. The cold climates they endured demanded it. The question becomes not whether they used garments, but how they fashioned them, how they stitched or tied, how they adorned or adapted. The answers remain hidden, awaiting discoveries that may come from new excavations or preserved fragments in permafrost. The presence of Denisovans in high altitude and northern environments also highlights the universality of clothing among human species. Wherever the cold pressed hard, human ingenuity responded with garments. Each lineage, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, found in hides a way to extend the body's limits, to push into climates otherwise uninhabitable. This convergence underscores the deep role of clothing in the human story. It is not the invention of one species alone, but a shared inheritance, a response to the same elemental challenge of cold. The differences may lie in refinement, stitched versus draped, adorned versus plain, but the principle is universal. To be human in the Ice Age was to be clothed. Denisovans also remind us of the fragility of the archaeological record. Entire lifeways can vanish from visibility, leaving behind only the faintest traces. A tooth in a cave, a finger bone buried in sediment, a genome recovered from powder. These are the fragments from which we reconstruct their world. In this context, the absence of preserved garments is unsurprising. Yet their absence does not erase the likelihood of their existence. The very survival of Denisovans in Siberia, the persistence of their genes in modern peoples testifies to their success in harsh environments. That success could not have been achieved without clothing. The question of symbolic clothing among Denisovans remains entirely open. Unlike Homo sapiens with beads and ochre, or Neanderthals with talons and pigments, Denisovans have left no clear evidence of adornment. It may be that their garments remained purely functional, or it may be that evidence of symbolism simply has not been found. In either case, their story emphasizes that clothing's first role is always survival. The decorative aspects that later flourish in Homo sapiens cultures are secondary to the primal need to endure. In the frozen highlands of Siberia, the scrape of hide against stone and the fastening of skins across shoulders would have been matters of life and death. The presence of Denisovans in the human story also deepens our understanding of migration. Their genes, passed into modern populations across Asia and Oceania, indicate that they ranged widely, interacting with multiple groups. Such mobility again suggests the use of clothing for travel across diverse climates requires portable protection. Whether moving through forest, across plains, or into mountains, garments would have shielded them from shifting conditions. Clothing thus forms part of the invisible infrastructure of Denisovan migrations, enabling their wide distribution despite the harshness of many environments. Reflecting on Denisovans reminds us that clothing is not only about what survives in caves or sediments, but about what must have been given the conditions. The cold is merciless. It allows no speculation. To live in Siberia is to be clothed, whether in stitched garments or draped hides. To endure high-altitude plateaus is to carry coverings against the wind. The Denisovans, though mysterious, must have embraced these practices, for without them their survival would be inexplicable. In this way, even their silence speaks, affirming the centrality of clothing in the human journey. In the dim recesses of Denisova cave, fires once burned, their smoke curling against stone walls, their warmth mingling with hides stretched and scraped. Figures huddled in the glow, clad in garments now long vanished, their breath misting in the cold air. Outside, snow fell across the Altai mountains, covering the land in silence. Within, the small acts of hide working and garment making carried lives through another winter. Though time has erased the garments, their necessity remains unquestioned. In the survival of Denisovans, in the persistence of their genes, in the very possibility of their habitation in such regions, clothing is implicit. Thus, the Denisovan puzzle, though incomplete, strengthens the wider truth wherever cold pressed hardest clothing emerged as humanity's shield. It was never one species alone that embraced this technology, but all who lived in the shadow of ice and wind. Denisovans, like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, wrapped themselves in the skins of animals, carried warmth with them, and in so doing carved out a place in a world shaped by frost. Their garments unseen remind us that clothing is not merely artifact but adaptation, not merely craft but continuity woven into the shared inheritance of all who once walked the ancient earth. As the earliest garments secured survival against wind and cold, another dimension slowly began to emerge adornment. The first coverings were practical stitched or tied with sinew to hold warmth close, yet humans soon began to shape them in ways that suggested meaning beyond necessity. The archaeological record of this period contains scattered clues, beads fashioned from pierced shells, pigments rubbed into hides, ochre stains preserved in cave sediments. These traces, the rare, point to a turning of garments from mere barriers against cold into symbols, expressions of identity and belonging. To clothe oneself became not only to endure, but also to be seen to signal affiliation, to shape the human body as a canvas of culture. The earliest ornaments appear in Africa, dating back over 100,000 years, close to the time when clothing was becoming widespread. At Blombos Cave, tiny shells bear holes drilled by human hands, their surfaces smoothed by wear, suggesting they were strung together as beads. Nearby ochre pieces show deliberate engraving and use as pigment. While these ornaments could be worn on the body itself, they may also have been attached to hides decorating garments. If so, then clothing had already begun to carry symbolic weight, not only shielding against climate, but proclaiming identity within the group. The emergence of ornamentation in this period is striking. It reveals a human impulse to transform necessity into art, to make even survival tools reflect shared meaning. Ochre in particular plays an intriguing role. This iron-rich mineral, available in shades of red, yellow and brown, is found at numerous prehistoric sites, often scraped or ground into powder. Its uses are varied, perhaps for body painting, perhaps for rituals, and possibly for colouring hides. Staining garments with ochre could have both practical and symbolic functions. The pigment may have helped preserve skins, deterring insects or stabilizing fibers. At the same time, color transforms the surface of clothing, marking it as more than raw hide. A red-stained garment glowing in firelight signals intention, the choice to present the body not only as insulated but as adorned. In this way, clothing becomes a medium of communication, silent yet potent. The use of shells and beads extends this transformation. Pierced shells strung together would glimmer in sunlight, catching attention, marking status or signifying group ties. When sewn onto hides or fastened to seams, they transformed garments into visible expressions of belonging. Archaeologists studying wear patterns on beads note that they rubbed against one another in strings consistent with necklaces or adornments worn repeatedly. The persistence of such ornaments across sites suggests that symbolic clothing was not an isolated experiment but a growing habit. It represents the first step toward the long tradition of humans using garments to express identity, whether through rank affiliation or beauty. The implications of this shift are profound. Clothing begins as survival technology, yet almost immediately it becomes social technology as well. By decorating hides, humans mark themselves as members of groups distinguishable from outsiders. Such signals would have mattered during encounters with neighbouring bands where identity could mean alliance or conflict. Symbolic clothing thus strengthens social cohesion within groups and communicates affiliation to others. It becomes part of the language of humanity, silent yet widely understood. The archaeological record from Europe and Asia echoes this trend, though later in time. At sites inhabited by Homo sapiens tens of thousands of years after their departure from Africa, beads and pendants appear alongside sewing tools. The convergence of stitched garments and ornamentation suggests that clothing had by then become a dual-purpose technology, practical and symbolic alike. Even Neanderthals, as evidenced by eagle talons strung into possible necklaces, may have shared in this impulse, though perhaps less elaborately. The universality of ornamentation across human species suggests a deep-rooted inclination to transform the utilitarian into the expressive. Adornment of clothing also intertwines with ritual and memory. A garment decorated with beads or coloured with ochre may serve as more than daily wear. It may carry meanings tied to life events, rites of passage, or the commemoration of ancestors. Such possibilities are speculative yet consistent with the trajectory of human culture. Clothing is uniquely positioned to carry such meaning, for it is always close to the body, always visible, always subject to collective attention. By adorning garments, humans transform them into objects of both personal and communal significance. The addition of decoration also changes the relationship between humans and time. Practical garments wear out, replaced as hides deteriorate. But decorated garments invite preservation care and perhaps ritual disposal. Beads can be transferred from one hide to another, carrying continuity across generations. Pigments can be reapplied, sustaining the symbolic layer even as materials are renewed. In this way, clothing becomes part of cultural inheritance, linking past and present, embedding meaning in the very fabric of survival. Symbolic clothing also reflects the growing complexity of human social life. As groups expanded in size, as encounters with other communities became more frequent, signals of identity grew more important. Adorned garments allowed individuals to mark their place within a network of kin and alliances. They also introduced differentiation: who possessed more beads, whose hides were coloured more vividly, whose garments bore the marks of greater skill. From such distinctions emerged the earlier signs of status, the roots of social hierarchies that would later grow more elaborate. Thus the first beads sewn onto hides, or the first streaks of ochre rubbed across skins, foreshadow the long history of clothing as a marker of power and prestige. Yet despite these social layers, the symbolic dimension did not erase the practical. The hide still needed to be scraped, softened, sewn. The garment still needed to shield against wind and frost. The beads and pigments simply overlaid survival with meaning. This layering of function and symbol is quintessentially human, the transformation of necessity into expression. In clothing, we see both aspects at once: the shield and the statement, the warmth and the identity. The presence of symbolic clothing at such an early stage in human history underscores the speed with which necessity becomes culture. Within a few tens of thousands of years after clothing's emergence, humans had already begun to adorn it. This is consistent with other forms of symbolic behaviour: engraved ochre-decorated tools, early art arising around the same time. Together, these behaviours signal a shift in human consciousness, an awareness not only of survival, but of meaning, of identity, of beauty. Clothing thus participates in the broader dawn of symbolic culture, a dawn that defines Homo sapiens as a species distinct, not only for its survival strategies, but for its creativity. One can imagine, though only dimly, the sight of early symbolic garments. In the flicker of firelight, hides coloured with ochre glow red and brown. Beads strung along seams catch sparks glinting in the darkness. Figures move within caves or across open plains, their coverings no longer merely shields against cold, but canvases of identity. The garments still smell of smoke, and fat still weigh heavily on shoulders, yet they speak as well as shield. They declare membership in a group's signal care in their making, embody the merging of survival and symbol. In these garments, the human journey takes a new step from clothing as protection to clothing as expression, from necessity to meaning from survival, alone to culture unfolding. As adornment finds its way onto garments, clothing takes on a deeper role in the shaping of human identity. It no longer functions solely as protection from cold or a surface for decoration, but becomes a marker of belonging, of differentiation of culture itself. In this period, one can begin to see the earliest threads of identity woven into garments, threads that would grow into the vast diversity of dress across human history. The simple act of attaching beads to hides or staining skins with ochre introduces a social dimension that extends far beyond survival. Clothing becomes a way of saying who one is, where one belongs, and how one fits within the fabric of a group. Identity expressed through dress arises naturally once garments become common. When everyone wears coverings, the details begin to matter: the choice of colour, the placement of ornaments, the cut of a seam. These distinctions may be small at first, but they hold meaning. A certain ochre shade might be preferred by one band, another by a different group. The number of beads or shells sewn into a hide might signal prestige, a memory of exchange, or a link to distant places where shells were gathered. In these variations, clothing becomes a social map carrying markers of identity across landscapes. It tells stories without words, making visible the bonds and boundaries of community. Archaeological finds of shell beads far from their oceanic sources illustrate this dynamic. Beads discovered in inland caves in Africa and the Levant must have been carried from coasts exchanged through networks of movement and trade. When sewn into garments, these beads would have been visible indicators of connection to distant environments. They made clothing not only a protection against cold, but also a testimony to social ties, mobility, and shared identity. A garment adorned with shells was a garment that carried a story of where the shells came from, of who traded them, of how they passed through hands to end up on that hide. Thus, identity became layered into clothing not only at the level of individual expression but across networks of human interaction. The symbolic role of clothing also intersects with gender, age, and life stage. Though direct evidence is scarce, it is plausible that certain garments were associated with particular roles. Children may have been swaddled in distinctive wrappings, women in certain adornments, hunters in garments suited for movement and marked by specific symbols. The universality of such distinctions in later societies suggests deep roots in prehistory. Clothing by its very nature touches every body, and in doing so it offers a surface upon which societies inscribe their categories and distinctions. To wear a garment is to carry a role, to embody identity not only as an individual, but as part of a social structure. The role of clothing in identity also emerges in burial practices. In some sites, bodies interred with beads and pigments hint that garments may have been part of mortuary rituals. Though the garments themselves have decayed, the placement of beads around skeletons suggests they were once sewn onto hides or garments worn by the deceased. Such practices reveal a recognition of clothing not only as daily necessity, but as a symbol of identity carried into death. To bury someone in adorned clothing is to acknowledge that their garments spoke of who they were, a message meant to endure even after life. Clothing thus becomes a vessel of memory, a way of preserving identity across the boundary of mortality. Clothing also functions as a marker of group boundaries. When different communities meet, their garments may serve as visual signals of difference. Variations in decoration, color, or style could communicate who belongs to which group, distinguishing allies from strangers. Such signals reduce uncertainty in encounters, making clothing part of the language of interaction. Even without shared speech, garments carry meaning across distance. A decorated hide signals not only warmth but cultural belonging, allowing humans to navigate the complexities of interaction in a world where groups frequently met, mingled, and sometimes clashed. The symbolic power of clothing also fosters cohesion within groups. Shared styles or adornments create visible unity, reinforcing bonds of belonging. When a group wears similar coverings adorned in similar ways, the garments themselves become expressions of collective identity. They remind individuals of their membership in a whole, of their shared traditions and survival strategies. In this sense, clothing becomes a cultural glue binding groups together visually as well as socially. It transforms survival technology into a medium of solidarity, a visible affirmation of who we are in contrast to others. The evolution of clothing into a marker of identity also reflects the broader trajectory of human symbolic behavior. Just as cave paintings depicted animals, beads adorned bodies, and ochre-coloured artifacts clothing carried meaning beyond function. This symbolic layer is not an afterthought, but an essential aspect of what it means to be human. The ability to imbue objects with meaning, to transform necessity into identity, is one of the hallmarks of Homo sapiens. Clothing, as one of the most intimate and constant objects of human life, becomes a primary surface for this symbolic expression. In contemplating these earliest threads of identity, one is struck by the continuity with later human history. From the first beads sewn onto hides to the elaborate garments of later civilizations, clothing has always functioned as more than protection. It has always been a language, a means of communication, a marker of belonging. The seeds of this long tradition are visible already in prehistory, when hides coloured with ochre and adorned with shells spoke of identity as surely as they shielded from cold. In the glow of firelight, one can imagine these garments taking shape. Scraped hides softened with fat, stitched with sinew, using bone needles then adorned with beads strung carefully through drilled holes. Pigments ground from ochre stones rubbed across surfaces, staining them red or yellow. The garments are practical, keeping bodies warm, but they are also expressive, carrying stories signalling belonging. As figures gather around the fire, their garments catch the light glinting, with shells glowing with colour. The scene is not only one of survival, but of culture identity woven into every seam. Thus, clothing at this stage of history is more than fabric of survival. It is fabric of identity, fabric of belonging, fabric of memory. It tells who humans are, how they see themselves, how they relate to others. It transforms necessity into symbol survival, into culture. And in doing so, it begins a trajectory that will stretch across millennia, from the first beads sewn onto hides to the elaborate traditions of dress in every society to come. The human story of clothing is thus never only about warmth. It is always also about identity, about the threads that bind individuals to groups to landscapes, and humanity to itself. The story of clothing is inseparable from the story of migration. Once humans had stitched hides into fitted garments and adorned them with beads and pigments, they carried these innovations into the journeys that spread our species across the globe. Migration was not a single event, but a series of waves, gradual movements that followed rivers, coastlines, and open plains. Each movement brought people into new climates, many colder than those of their African homelands. Without clothing, such journeys would have been impossible. With garments, the limits of habitation expanded and entire continents opened before human feet. Clothing in this sense was as essential as fire or stone blades in enabling the great dispersals of Homo sapiens. The migration into Siberia offers one of the clearest illustrations. By at least 45,000 years ago, humans were present in these northern reaches, enduring winters of unrelenting cold. The archaeological record here includes finely crafted bone needles, their delicate eyes suggesting garments of considerable sophistication. Such tools reveal that humans entering Siberia were not draping hides loosely across shoulders, but tailoring them closely to conserve heat. Fitted leggings, boots, and layered tunics would have been necessary to endure temperatures that plunged well below freezing. With such clothing, humans did not merely survive in Siberia. They thrived, hunting mammoth and reindeer, gathering in shelters, moving across frozen plains. Without garments, these landscapes would have remained closed. With them, humans entered and flourished. The implications of these migrations extend further. From Siberia, groups eventually moved eastward, crossing the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. This vast corridor, exposed during glacial periods when sea levels fell, was a region of harsh winds and icy expanses. To cross it required not only determination but technology. Fire-warmed campsites, but only clothing carried warmth across the miles of exposed terrain. The garments of these early migrants must have been layered, well-stitched, and carefully maintained, for a failed seam could mean frostbite or death. The success of these journeys testifies to the resilience of clothing as a technology, its capacity to extend human life into the harshest conditions on Earth. In Europe, migration intersected with glacial cycles in complex ways. During warmer interglacials, landscapes open with forests and grasslands supporting diverse game. During glacial maxima, ice sheets advanced, compressing human populations into refuges. In both contexts, clothing remained essential. In open forests, garments allowed hunters to move silently, protected from chill. In refuges, they conserved warmth through long winters in caves or shelters. The adornments found at European sites, beads, pigments, pendants, suggest that clothing also carried identity across these migrations, marking groups as they moved, preserving cohesion during times of stress. Clothing thus functioned both as shield and symbol binding communities as they navigated shifting climates. The great migrations into Australia, though occurring through tropical and subtropical environments, also underscore the universality of clothing. Even where cold was less severe, garments provided protection from rain, sun, and insects. Kangaroo hides, plant fibres, and other local materials would have been shaped into coverings suited to regional conditions. The principle remained the same: clothing extends the body's resilience, enabling habitation of environments otherwise difficult. Whether shielding against frost in Siberia or sun in Australia, garments provided a flexible adaptation, shaping migration into a global phenomenon. The role of clothing in migration also emphasizes the importance of portability. Unlike shelters which are fixed or fires which must be rekindled, clothing travels with the body. It requires maintenance but not constant rebuilding. This portability allows groups to move continuously to cover long distances without losing protection. It makes migration not only possible, but sustainable, reducing reliance on finding shelter each night. In this sense, clothing transforms landscapes from obstacles into pathways extending the reach of human movement. The archaeological record reflects this portability in the distribution of tools. Scrapers' awls and needles are found in campsites scattered across continents, evidence of hide processing and garment making carried wherever humans went. These tools were small enough to transport, durable enough to use repeatedly, versatile enough to adapt to different hides. Their presence across Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas reveals a shared technological repertoire, one that travelled with humans as they expanded. Clothing was not an isolated innovation, but a companion of migration, its methods and tools spread alongside footprints across the globe. Clothing also shaped migration indirectly by influencing survival rates. In colder environments, infants and elders are most vulnerable. Garments allowed them to survive journeys that would otherwise have claimed their lives. This survival strengthened social continuity, preserving knowledge, traditions, and group cohesion. By extending protection across generations, clothing ensured that migration was not only possible, but sustainable across time. Each garment stitched for a child, each hide wrapped around an elder, contributed to the survival of cultural memory, allowing knowledge of landscapes, tools, and traditions to pass forward. Migration and clothing also intersect in symbolic ways. Adorned garments carried markers of identity across vast distances, ensuring that groups maintained cohesion even as they moved. Beads sewn into hides could signal shared origins, reminding migrants of where they came from, even as they ventured into new territories. Pigments rubbed onto clothing could serve as portable expressions of cultural identity, visible across campsites in unfamiliar lands. In this way, clothing preserved not only warmth but also belonging, carrying culture across landscapes, as surely as it carried protection. The link between clothing and migration also underscores the broader human strategy of adaptation. Unlike other species which evolve biologically to suit specific environments, humans rely heavily on culture to bridge gaps. Clothing exemplifies this approach. Rather than evolving thick fur, humans invented garments. Rather than waiting for bodies to change, they shaped hides with needles and sinew. This reliance on culture allowed rapid migration, for garments could be made within a generation far faster than evolution could alter physiology. It is this cultural adaptability embodied in clothing that explains the extraordinary speed of human dispersal compared to other species. In contemplating the migrations enabled by clothing, one sees not only the spread of humanity, but the spread of culture itself. Each step into new landscapes carried with it technologies of survival, symbols of identity, and traditions of craft. Clothing became one of the threads binding these elements together, ensuring continuity even as environments changed. From the caves of Africa to the tundras of Siberia, from the coasts of Southeast Asia to the plains of the Americas, garments shielded bodies and carried identities, weaving humanity into a global presence. One can imagine the sight of migrants moving across frozen plains, their breath clouding in the air, their bodies wrapped in stitched hides. Bone needles and scrapers rest in their bags, ready for repairs. Children swaddled in furs ride on parents' backs. Elders walk supported by companions. Hunters stride ahead with spears. The garments they wear are heavy, smelling of smoke and fat, yet they are shields against the cold enablers of movement, symbols of belonging. Each step forward, each horizon crossed is made possible by the clothing stitched in firelight, carried across miles, preserved across generations. Thus clothing and migration are bound together. The garments enabled the journeys, and the journeys spread the garments. Together they transformed humanity from a regional species into a global one. Clothing born of necessity on cold nights in Africa became the passport that carried humans into every climate, every continent, every corner of the world. In the story of migration, as in the story of survival, clothing is the silent companion always present, always essential, always woven into the fabric of human history. Though most clothing from deep prehistory has vanished, leaving little trace, a handful of archaeological discoveries preserve faint imprints of the garments once worn. These rare finds, fragile and fragmentary, provide glimpses of what is otherwise invisible, in caves, in burials, and in unusual conditions of preservation. The faint outlines of fibers, the impressions of woven patterns pressed into clay, and the placement of beads around skeletons hint at the forms of ancient clothing. Each fragment is a window into daily life, into the coverings that once shielded bodies and signalled identity. They are small discoveries, yet they carry immense significance, for they confirm directly what indirect evidence had long suggested that clothing was central to human existence in the Ice Age. One line of evidence comes from the imprints of textiles left in clay or on hardened surfaces. At certain sites, impressions of woven fibres remain where garments once lay, their original material long decayed, but their patterns preserved in negative form. These impressions reveal that humans were experimenting with weaving plant fibres tens of thousands of years ago, while hides remain the dominant material for warmth in colder climates. Plant fibres offered flexibility and lightness, suitable for regions where heavy furs were impractical. The presence of such imprints demonstrates that clothing was not limited to animal skins, but included an expanding repertoire of materials, each chosen for local conditions. Burials offer another kind of evidence. In some graves dating back tens of thousands of years, beads and ornaments are found in patterns, suggesting they were once sewn onto garments. Around the bones of the dead, strings of beads lie in arcs and lines, positioned as they would have been on clothing. These arrangements imply not only that the deceased were buried in garments, but that those garments carried adornments significant to the living. Such burials suggest a deep symbolic role for clothing, one that extended beyond life into rituals of death. Clothing here becomes not only a daily shield, but a final gift, a marker of identity meant to accompany individuals into the afterlife. In rare cases, actual fragments of clothing survive. At sites in Europe and the Middle East, scraps of twisted plant fibres preserved by unusual soil chemistry or extreme dryness reveal the existence of cordage and textiles. These fragments are tiny, yet they speak volumes. To twist fibres into cord requires planning, dexterity, and knowledge of materials. Once cord exists, it can be used for weaving, sewing, or fastening garments. Such discoveries show that humans were not limited to hides, but were exploring the possibilities of plants expanding the range of clothing technology. They hint at garments lighter and more flexible than stitched skins, garments suited for warmer climates, or for layering beneath hides in colder regions. These rare survivals remind us of how much has been lost. Leather, fur, and fibre decay quickly, especially in humid or variable environments. What remains is only the fraction preserved by chance, a bead pattern, an imprint in clay, a scrap in a dry cave. Yet these fragments, when combined with tools and residues, form a coherent picture. They confirm that clothing was not an occasional adaptation, but a central, continuous feature of human life. They also highlight the ingenuity of our ancestors who experimented with multiple materials, methods, and designs to create garments suited for diverse environments. The archaeological glimpses also reveal the intimacy of clothing in human experience. Garments touched the body, constantly carried warmth, bore symbols, and accompanied individuals into death. The placement of beads on burials suggests that clothing was seen as part of identity, inseparable from the self. The imprints of fibres in clay suggest daily use of woven items, perhaps mats, bags, or coverings, that made life more comfortable. Clothing was not only about survival in the cold, but about shaping human environments more broadly, creating layers of comfort and meaning that extended into every aspect of life. Such discoveries also underscore the continuity between prehistoric clothing and later traditions. The beads sewn into hides in Ice Age burials foreshadow the decorated garments of later cultures. The woven imprints prefigure the textiles that would one day dominate human clothing. The scraps of cordage point toward the long history of fibre manipulation, from simple threads to complex looms. In each case, the seeds of later traditions are visible, planted deep in prehistory. Clothing thus links past and future, tying the first coverings of hides to the elaborate fashions of later civilizations. The symbolic role of clothing in burials also suggests the emergence of memory and storytelling. To bury someone in adorned garments is to acknowledge that their identity mattered, that their covering spoke of who they were. It is also to create a memory for the living, a reminder of the person's place in the group. Clothing in this context becomes a medium of narrative, a way of telling stories about lives through the objects that touch them most intimately. Even when garments decayed, the beads and pigments endured, preserving fragments of those stories for archaeologists to uncover millennia later. The faint traces of prehistoric garments also remind us of the fragility of material culture. So much of human history is lost not because it never existed, but because it did not survive. Garments, shelters, and wooden tools vanish easily, leaving behind only stone, bone, and beads. Yet the rare survivals confirm that the invisible was real. They invite us to imagine the richness of daily life in prehistory, where people wore garments coloured with pigment, adorned with ornaments stitched with care. They encourage us to see the past not as bare and primitive, but as layered, textured, and complex, even when direct evidence is scarce. One can picture the scene: a burial in a cave, a body laid carefully on the ground, covered with hides adorned with beads. Ochre dusts the surface, colouring both the garment and the body it covers. Shells gleam faintly in the firelight as companions complete the ritual, leaving behind a pattern that will outlast the hides themselves. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover the beads, their placement still echoing the form of the garment. The clothing itself is gone, but its memory endures in the pattern in the story carried forward by the arrangement of beads around bones. Thus, the rare glimpses of prehistoric garments, though fragmentary, confirm the centrality of clothing in human life. They show that garments were made not only for survival, but for meaning, for identity, for continuity. They demonstrate the ingenuity of our ancestors in shaping hides, fibres, and ornaments into coverings that protected, expressed, and remembered. In these fragments, one sees the outlines of a story that stretches from the first scraped hides to the global diversity of clothing today. A story woven into every seam and every bead, a story of humanity clothed not only in necessity but in culture. Clothing is not only a shield against the elements or a surface for beads and pigments, but also a record of landscapes themselves. Every garment fashioned in prehistory drew directly from the environment, embodying the plants, animals, and resources of a given region. In this sense, clothing was a way of wearing the land, of carrying its materials and meanings on the body. Hides, sinew furs, feathers, and fibres, each told of the animals hunted and the plants gathered. To look at a garment was to see not only human ingenuity, but the signature of an ecosystem stitched and tied into form. Garments were thus ecological artifacts as much as cultural ones, woven from the intimate relationship between people and the worlds they inhabited. The dominance of animal hides in colder climates reflects this relationship clearly. In the steppes of Eurasia, reindeer and mammoth provided thick furs essential for enduring the cold. In temperate regions, deer, antelope, and wild cattle supplied hides suitable for lighter coverings. Each hide carried the qualities of the animal. It came from warmth, durability, pliability. To process a hide was to engage directly with the ecology of a region, to translate the body of an animal into the body of a garment. Hunters did not simply kill for food, they harvested ecosystems for survival, transforming the skins of prey into shields against climate. In this way, clothing stands at the intersection of ecology and culture, a material expression of how humans lived within their environments. Plant fibers too shaped garments in places where vegetation offered resources. Twisted fibers from flax, nettle, or grasses could be spun into cords woven into mats or stitched into clothing. Archaeological fragments of such fibers preserved in rare conditions reveal that humans were experimenting with plant-based textiles tens of thousands of years ago. These fibers provided alternatives to hides, particularly in warmer climates where heavy furs were impractical. Fiber garments were lighter, more breathable, more suited to regions where insulation was less critical, but protection from sun insects or abrasion was needed. The use of plants for clothing demonstrates the adaptability of humans, their ability to shift materials according to ecological conditions. It also underscores their intimate knowledge of landscapes, the awareness of which plants yielded strong fibers, which could be twisted, which could endure wear. Sinew played an equally vital role. The tough fibrous tissue from animal tendons could be dried, split, and used as thread for stitching hides. Its strength and flexibility made it ideal for sewing, binding, and fastening. Without sinew, the potential of bone needles would have remained limited. With it, humans could create seams that held under strain garments that endured repeated use and coverings that were fitted rather than draped. Every seam stitched with sinew carried within it the anatomy of an animal woven into human survival. In this way, clothing embodied the interdependence of species, the transfer of materials from animal to human in the service of life. Feathers and decorative elements further illustrate how landscapes were worn. Though primarily symbolic, feathers attached to garments connected humans with the birds of their environment, transforming plumage into markers of identity. The colours of pigments derived from minerals and soils also tied clothing to landscapes. Ochre gathered from cliffs, charcoal from fires, white chalk from riverbeds, all could be applied to garments, staining them with the hues of the land. To wear such clothing was to wear the earth itself, to carry its textures and colours as part of human identity. The variability of materials across regions reveals how garments recorded geography. In Africa, lighter hides and plant fibres reflected warmer climates. In Europe, thick furs and layered hides mirrored glacial conditions. In Asia, garments combined hides with woven cords drawing from diverse ecosystems. In each place, clothing served as an index of environment, a catalogue of ecological knowledge. The garments were not uniform but specific, tailored to local conditions, reflecting the deep human capacity to adapt materials to need. To reconstruct ancient clothing is thus to reconstruct ancient ecologies, to trace the ways in which landscapes were woven into human life. The use of multiple materials also reveals the layering of clothing as technology. A single garment could combine hide, sinew, beads, and pigment, each drawn from different sources. The hide came from a hunted animal, the sinew from its tendons, the beads from distant coasts, the pigment from mineral deposits. To assemble such a garment was to integrate diverse parts of an ecosystem, to combine local and distant resources into a single object. Clothing thus became a nexus of ecological relationships, a material synthesis of human interaction with the world. Each seam, bead, and stain spoke of journeys across landscapes, of exchanges between groups, of the gathering of resources from multiple environments. The ecological dimension of clothing also carried symbolic weight. To wear the hide of an animal was not only to use its warmth, but perhaps also to carry part of its identity. Later ethnographic parallels suggest that garments could symbolize connections with animals, whether as prey allies or spirits. Though direct evidence from prehistory is scarce, the continuity of such associations in later cultures suggests deep roots. A reindeer hide garment might signal not only insulation but affiliation with the herds that sustained life. Pigment applied to hides might symbolize not only color, but connection to the earth from which it was drawn. Clothing thus served as a medium for expressing relationships with landscapes, encoding ecological bonds into cultural symbols. The crafting of garments also required knowledge of seasons. Animals carried thicker hides in winter than in summer. Plants yielded fibers at certain stages of growth. To create effective clothing, humans had to time their harvests to know when to hunt for hides, suitable for winter garments, when to gather plants for strong fibers. Clothing was thus tied to calendars of environment embedded in seasonal cycles of ecology. Each garment represented not only skill in processing materials, but timing in gathering them and awareness of rhythms that extended beyond human life to encompass the entire ecosystem. In this way, clothing becomes a record of ecological knowledge, one of the clearest reflections of how humans lived within their environments. It demonstrates adaptability, foresight, and awareness of resources. It embodies the integration of multiple species and materials into human survival. It reveals the continuity between necessity and symbol, between ecology and culture. Every garment was at once a shield, a statement, and a synthesis of the landscape from which it was drawn. One can imagine the process in detail. A hunter brings down a reindeer, its hide thick with winter fur. The hide is scraped with stone, softened with fat, stitched with sinew drawn from its tendons. Pigment from nearby ochre cliffs stains the surface. Beads from a distant coast are sewn into seams. The garment that emerges carries the animal's warmth, the land's colour, the sea's ornaments. It embodies the environment, making it wearable, portable, intimate. To wear such a garment is to carry the world on one's body, to transform landscape into identity, ecology into culture. Thus, the weaving of landscapes into garments underscores the profound role of clothing in human history. It is not only a human invention, but a collaboration with the world, a practice that integrates plants, animals, minerals, and knowledge into a single form. Clothing is ecology, made portable, culture, made visible, identity, made tangible. In its seams and surfaces lies the record of landscapes, the memory of environments carried forward on human bodies as they moved across the ancient earth. The emergence of clothing marks one of the quiet revolutions in human history, a change so gradual and understated that its significance can be overlooked, yet its consequences reach into every aspect of what it means to be human. From the first scraped hides draped over shoulders to the stitched garments sewn with bone needles, clothing altered the relationship between humans and their environments. It transformed survival strategies, enabled migrations, fostered identity, and became a canvas for meaning. In the long silence of prehistory, clothing is a thread that binds together necessity and culture, shielding bodies while shaping societies. At its most basic, clothing is a shield. Nights in Africa grew colder as climates shifted, winds cut across open plains, and the Pleistocene world pressed its chill into human skin. In response, hides were scraped, softened, and wrapped around bodies. Fire provided heat, but garments carried warmth wherever people travelled. This portability marked a turning point, allowing humans to step beyond the narrow margins of climate tolerance. With clothing, environments that once excluded them became habitable. The Ice Age, with its advancing glaciers and deep winters, might have constrained humanity. Instead, through clothing, humans adapted, endured, and expanded. Yet the significance of clothing lies not only in its practicality, but in its cultural weight. Tools associated with garment making, scrapers, awls, and needles, represent some of the earliest evidence of technological specialization. These tools embody foresight and patience, qualities central to human culture. Scraping hides is laborious sewing with sinew, meticulous dyeing with ochre deliberate. Each step requires memory and teaching skills passed across generations. Clothing thus reflects the transmission of knowledge, the continuity of culture, the investment of time in collective survival. It is both artifact and tradition, both material and memory. The advent of sewing in particular altered human possibilities. With bone needles, garments could be tailored, layered, and adjusted. Fitted clothing conserved heat more efficiently, making possible the spread of humans into Siberia, northern Europe, and eventually the Americas. This single innovation expanded the range of human habitation beyond what physiology alone could endure. Clothing became a second skin, one not dictated by evolution but shaped by culture. In this lies one of humanity's defining traits, the ability to replace biological adaptation with cultural invention. Clothing exemplifies this substitution, a fragile but effective technology that compensated for the lack of fur and carried humans across frozen continents. Clothing also transformed human relationships with animals and landscapes. Every garment represented the labor of ecosystems: hides from prey, sinew from tendons, pigments from minerals, beads from distant shores, fibers from plants. To craft a garment was to assemble the landscape into wearable form. Each seam tied humans more closely to the species they depended on. Each pigment connected them to the earth beneath their feet. In this way, clothing reveals the ecological entanglement of humanity, the integration of environment into culture. To be clothed was to wear the land itself, to carry it as shield and symbol. The symbolic dimension of clothing emerges early. Beads sewn into hides, ochre rubbed onto surfaces, ornaments attached to seams. These gestures transform garments into carriers of identity. Clothing begins to speak silently of who belongs to whom, who holds status, who carries memory. In burials, beads arranged around skeletons suggest garments adorned for rituals of death, clothing as both final covering and expression of identity. In life and in death, garments become markers of belonging, carrying meaning that transcends function. They signal membership in groups, differentiate individuals, and preserve stories. This layering of meaning anticipates the role of clothing in all subsequent human history. What begins as necessity evolves into identity, and what begins as identity evolves into culture. The trajectory is visible already in prehistory, where the dual function of clothing as shield and symbol is firmly established. It is a reminder that culture does not arise suddenly in great leaps, but quietly in the accumulation of small gestures, a seam sewn more neatly, a hide stained with pigment, a bead tied into place. In these acts, the foundation of cultural identity is built, and clothing becomes one of its most enduring expressions. The quiet revolution of clothing also reshaped migration. With garments, humans no longer waited for climates to shift, but carried their own climates with them. Clothing enabled expansion into deserts, tundras, and mountains, transforming migration into a global phenomenon. It ensured that infants and elders could survive journeys, preserving social continuity. It allowed groups to move farther, faster, and more flexibly than would have been possible without cultural insulation. The spread of humanity into nearly every environment on Earth within a relatively short time frame is inseparable from this innovation. Clothing is not simply background to migration, it is one of its engines. In considering the quiet revolution of clothing, one also sees its role in shaping human self-perception. To wear a garment is to alter the boundary between body and world, to mediate the relationship between skin and environment. Clothing creates distance from climate, allowing humans to experience landscapes not as threats but as possibilities. It changes how the body is seen not only by others but by the self. Covered skin becomes surface for identity, canvas for meaning. In this way, clothing participates in the broader human project of transforming nature into culture, survival into symbolism. The rarity of preserved garments reminds us of the fragility of this revolution. The hide's fibres and threads of prehistory are gone, leaving behind only indirect traces, tools, beads, pigments, parasites. Yet these traces, when woven together, tell a coherent story. They reveal that clothing was not an optional accessory but a fundamental technology, as essential as fire and stone tools. Its absence from the archaeological record is a silence filled by inference, by the logic of survival, by the rare fragments that have endured. The very scarcity of evidence underscores the resilience of the practice, for its invisibility is not absence, but loss, a loss filled by the continuity of its effects. In the quiet work of scraping hides, of piercing with awls, of stitching with sinew, humanity reshaped its future. The gestures were small, the tools fragile, the garments perishable, yet their impact was immense. Clothing allowed survival through Ice Age nights, migration across frozen steppes, the flourishing of culture through identity and adornment. It stitched humanity into landscapes otherwise uninhabitable, carried warmth beyond firelight, and transformed necessity into expression. It was and remains one of the most intimate and enduring technologies woven into daily life, worn against the skin inseparable from the human story. One can imagine as the Ice Age deepens, a group huddled in a cave, fires burning, low garments pulled close. Outside, snow falls across a frozen landscape, winds howl against stone. Inside, beads glint faintly on hides. Pigments glow red in firelight, seams stitched with sinew hold warmth close. The garments are heavy, bearing the marks of labour of animals, of landscapes. Yet they are also symbols carrying identity, belonging memory. In these garments lies the quiet revolution, the thread that ties humans to their past, to their environments, to each other. It is a revolution not of conquest, but of endurance, not of sudden change, but of steady adaptation. Thus ends the story of the first clothing humans wore 100,000 years ago, a story told in silence and fragments in tools and parasites in beads and burials. It is the story of how garments shielded bodies and shaped cultures, how they enabled migrations and carried identities, how they transformed survival into culture. The quiet revolution of clothing is not only a chapter of prehistory, but a foundation of humanity itself, a reminder that even the simplest technologies can alter the course of our species. In every seam and every thread lies the memory of that revolution woven into the fabric of human history.